Ladies and gentlemen, friends of literature, friends of culture, I'm very happy to welcome you tonight for a very special event of Book World Prague 2021. I feel like it's a rebirth because, well, as you know, we have been silent for 2 years and a half now. You all know why. And tonight, I'm very happy to be here with you, not just because I'm the artistic director of the fair, but also because, as you, I am a lover of books. I like to read books. I like to listen to the voice, but I also like to listen to the voice of their authors. Tonight we are back, and tonight, for this very special event, we have a very special guest, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Thank you for being with us. And I have to thank you also for something. We are back here, and we are not back to normal, unless exceptional is normal. Because your voice, your books, your talk, your thoughts are all resonating through the world, from Lagos to New York, to London, to Berlin, and tonight to Prague. Thank you. And for this exceptional meeting, we decided to move it into an exceptional place, the Gulliver airship, a place which exists nowhere else like that, but in Prague. And we are very happy to show something exceptional of Prague. I am very happy to be with you on the stage. However, I'm also very impatient to stop talking, to go to sit, and to listen to you. Thanks a lot. Have a nice talk. Thank you.
Guillaume, thank you very much for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome one of the most widely acclaimed writers in the English language, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who arrived today, as I heard. She's tired from lengthy traveling, but it's a unique event, and I'm really glad that you found time to be with us and to share your thoughts with us. I will start with a question that inspired me when I read one of your interviews. In one of the interviews that you gave, you complained about an unpleasant experience that you had with French custom officers or something like that. And so I want to just make sure that everything was fine in Prague.
No, it was terrible in Prague. No, I'm joking. So thank you everyone for being here. My first time in Prague. I haven't had a chance to see Prague, so I haven't had a chance to see whether Prague lives up to its reputation of being the most handsome city in Europe. I hope it does, because otherwise I'll be terribly disappointed. The reason that I cannot answer your question honestly is because I did not arrive directly from Lagos to Prague. And so because I came from, where did I connect? Frankfurt. So I didn't actually go through, yeah. I went through immigration in Frankfurt, not in Prague.
Okay, thank you. So let's start with questions. Your novels, most of your books have been translated into Czech, and as far as I can tell, these are very fine translations indeed. Americana was, your Czech publisher told me today, was one of the most successful of your books. So I would like to start with a question related to Americana. In that book, there is, it takes place roughly before the election of Barack Obama, the American president, and there is a certain kind of optimism in that book. The optimism related to his person and the hope that him in the office might change something about the ills of American society. Has this hope been fulfilled or not?
I think, well, obviously, what came after Barack Obama, I think, was very telling, and maybe is a good answer to the question, which is, I think, that the fact that the president after Barack Obama, whose name I just do not enjoy saying, I think it said something about Obama. In other words, I think that president in some ways was a result of Obama. So a kind of backlash, I think. So maybe the answer to the question then is that no, the hope that, and the optimism that I think is in Americana and that I had personally, and I had that as well throughout Obama's presidency, kind of felt squashed, diminished by the president who came after Obama. But I should also say that I don't think I necessarily expected Obama to be a messiah. I think that one of the problems I felt in the way that he was perceived is that the expectations on him were way too high, too much. It's impossible to fix a problem that's been there for decades. And America's problems. And you know, America is a place I feel a strong affinity to. It's my second home. And you know, I love it sometimes. And I didn't expect Obama to solve all of America's problems. I think actually for me, part of the reason I felt so optimistic was, if anything, really the symbolic importance of Obama becoming president, because I really think that symbolism matters. And obviously I thought his politics was okay, but my point is I didn't expect that he would solve all of America's problems.
Did he solve some of them then?
I think so. I mean, I think that there are things, some decisions he made that I thought were good, some that I didn't necessarily agree with. I think in general that, I think in the US, the Democratic Party obviously is a party I think that just makes a bit more sense and has a bit more compassion. I do think that Obama had a particularly difficult time because he was dealing with a United States Congress that was determined, because it was dominated by the Republicans, was determined to, as actually one of them said, make him a one-term president. So I think it made things difficult for him, just a kind of automatic opposition to almost anything that he wanted to do. I think he would have achieved more had he not had that kind of, that kind of really unique problem.
And where do you see America now? I mean, after Trump's presidency, I mean, is it a new hope?
You know what? After Trump, I feel like anything would be hopeful. I mean, but I mean, yes, I think that it's just a nice feeling. I remember watching the news when Biden won, and I was in Lagos, so I wasn't in the US, but just feeling that finally a grown-up was back in charge. And there's something about it that's reassuring. When you just think, it's like, for so long, 4 years, you gave the keys of the car to a toddler. And then, all of a sudden, a grown-up is back. And of course, the grown-up is not going to be perfect. The grown-up is going to make mistakes. But you just feel a bit more comfortable because it's an adult. So that's how I feel about America right now.
Okay, thank you. I was asking, especially in regards to problems that are being discussed by scholars, by lawyers, that there are books, on American legal system, about racism in the legal system, and the orange is the new black and stuff and like that. So I was asking whether you have hope that something might change in this regard, because you speak eloquently in your interviews about racism in the attitudes of people. But I wonder whether there is any hope that something might change in the system.
I think President Biden has opportunities that Obama, because in some ways, Obama being a black man, I think was really the major reason that Republicans wanted to just squash anything he wanted to do. Biden doesn't have that problem. He just has the usual problem of the terrible polarized nature of American politics. But I think he has an opportunity, Biden. And so, I think, for example, conversations around voting rights, which is really a conversation about race. I mean, the problem in America, and one of the things I found really interesting when I first went to the US, was how often race is talked about using proxy language. So, and it took me a while to understand this. So, when people would talk about states' rights, and I would notice that people would really get very upset, and I used to wonder, well, why? I mean, states' rights sounds okay to me, but actually it's a conversation about race, because it goes back to the Civil War, where the war was really about maintaining slavery, but they used the language of states' rights. So now in the US, whenever Republicans say states' rights, people on the left get very upset because it's about race. And so the voting rights that they're talking about now, one of the states just passed a really repressive bill about voting rights. But again, they use the language of states' rights. You know, a state should determine how they organize their voting. But when you decide, for example, that people cannot vote unless they show 3 different forms of identification at the voting station, you're targeting black people. Because in general, it's black people who are unlikely to have 3 different kinds of identification. But actually, when they're having the conversation, they're not mentioning race, but really it's about race. I think Biden has an opportunity to, structural racism in America took 300 years to establish, so it's going to take a long time to dismantle. But I do think that he has opportunities that I hope he uses, but also I think he also has the difficulty of how deeply polarized American politics is now, where I feel as though Republicans don't actually think about what will benefit the country. They're just really out to try and destroy anything that comes from the Democrats, and it's such an immature way to deal with.
Do you think it's just politics, or is it society at large that's polarized?
Yeah. I think society is polarized, yes. It's interesting to think about which came first, because 25 years ago, American politics was not this polarized, nor was American society. I don't want to be that person who blames the former president for everything. But I do think that he contributed a lot to the polarization in the US. I mean, I really believe that leadership sets the tone for a society. And so if you have a leader who thinks and talks in a particular way, it's going to affect the way that people down with the grassroots relate to one another. And so I really do think that the former president in the US contributed to the polarization of society. But yes, the society is so polarized. There are things that have been politicized that shouldn't be. And one of them is this pandemic. The way that in the US, you board a flight in the US today and they spend 10 minutes telling you that it's federal law to wear a mask, because masks and vaccines have become such politicized subjects where people are screaming at each other in schools.
Same here.
Really? Oh, so I guess we can't blame Trump then. Who can we blame? I mean, I just find it, it's such an interesting thing to me that one can politicize science, right? And that's interesting that it's here, because I was thinking, having sort of observed Germany, for example, or the UK, that it's not that much of a phenomenon in the way that it is in the US, where people attend meetings to sort of talk about their towns, and it ends up being a shouting match about wearing masks. And I'm thinking, but it's actually to save lives. So I find that, I guess my point is, there's a kind of polarization of subjects that shouldn't really be politicized at all. But that's the case in the US now. Almost everything is political.
Well, it's more or less the same, especially with the extremist parties that use, the fight against vaccines and so on and so forth. And what about the relationship to history? Because America, because of its slavery, has deeply troubled history. So is there any kind of development that you have seen in recent years?
I don't actually slavery is interesting, but not to me really, and I'll tell you why. Because I think when people talk about race in the US, especially people who want to be dismissive of race, they will say, oh, slavery happened, but it ended. And I think that the problem with race in the US, obviously started with slavery, but actually the problem with race in the US is about things that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, so things that happened long after slavery, long after the brief period that they called Reconstruction. And, my American home is in Maryland, for example, and I just find it really incredible that 30 years ago, 20 years ago, around the state of Maryland, there were communities that would drain swimming pools so that black people would not swim. They would rather shut down their pool than have one black family swim. And I find that incredible, and it's relatively recent. That in Boston in the 1970s, you had, adults, men and women, screaming at little children who wanted to go to school because they did not want the schools to be, they did not want black kids in their children's schools. And so and for me, I think about things like those children today are in their 50s. And for me, the question is, what is the damage that has been done? Because these children have inherited a terrible kind of, it's a terrible inheritance of pain, of being made to feel that you're inferior. And these are the people who are alive today in the US. And it's not really acknowledged and talked about. And that, for me, is a big problem. So I just, slavery, it doesn't interest me very much.
Okay, well, I perhaps articulated the question wrongly. What I meant history at large. I was shocked the other day. It was, I think, in the Times Story supplement. I read about the terrible massacre in the 20s, the Tulsa massacre in Oklahoma or somewhere. And they said in the article that children in Oklahoma were actually not allowed to learn about this terrible event at schools. So it struck me as outrageous that on the one hand you have universities who pay so much attention to all kinds of problems, sometimes imaginary, and on the other hand you have children not being allowed to learn about the history.
Can I ask for some examples of the imaginary problems that universities pay attention to? Because I find this very interesting.
I wouldn't go into being a lecturer at university. I wouldn't go into much detail.
I get your point. Completely, I take your point. No, you're right. I also find it, in general, the history of African Americans, and by that I don't mean black Americans, I mean African Americans, which is to say the people whose descendants were enslaved, right? Because today you have black Americans whose families came from Nigeria or Ghana, 20 or 30 years ago. But African Americans, the history of African Americans in the US is just not, it's not taught. It's not as well known as it should be. And I find that, honestly, I just find it shocking. When I first came to the US, I had to learn it on my own because I didn't understand. There was so much I didn't understand about America. I didn't understand race. I didn't really get racism because I had come from Nigeria where everybody was black. And so I get to the US and suddenly I'm black. And it's a new identity because in Nigeria, I didn't think of myself as black. I did not need to think of myself as black. And it also meant that I had to learn about racism. And so I remember making the choice to go to the library all the time and to read African American history and African American literature. And I was just shocked. Right? I remember the first time I read about the massacres in Oklahoma. And I remember thinking, really? This isn't not that long ago. There was a similar massacre in, where now? Somewhere in the South. Again, of a thriving black community of lawyers, doctors, And suddenly you have white Americans who feel very resentful about this, and they find a small reason and they burn down that area and, you know, sort of just chase the people out. And the fact that this is not widely known, I think, is also part of the problem, because it means that the conversations in the US today about race are so I'm going to say polarized, but I guess we've said that enough. But I guess my point is that increasingly I think that if we knew more, if America made African American history more known, more ordinary, more sort of, if the average American knew African American history, it seems to me that many of the conversations about race would not be as fraught as they are, because it's very easy for people who do not know to be dismissive of genuine concerns of African Americans. So an African American is talking about racism, and invariably you will hear somebody say, oh, but slavery ended 100 years ago, what are you talking about? Because these people, I think a lot of them do not know what happened after slavery. People kind of know vaguely, oh, Martin Luther King gave the speech and then black people could vote. But actually don't even know that even after the Voting Rights Act was passed, so many African Americans still had a lot of difficulty actually voting. And because people don't know this, I think it makes the conversation so difficult to have and so easy to dismiss. And even expressions like white supremacy, which is quite common in sort of leftist circles in America, it's very easy for people to dismiss because they're like, what are you talking about? That's a bit dramatic, right? But if they actually knew the history, it's not dramatic at all, it's the truth. So I feel very strongly that history matters. I mean, I feel this way about history everywhere, of course, Nigeria as well. But in the US, I think African American history in particular.
You captured this unique experience of coming to America from Nigeria in Americana. And do you think that the fact that you live in both countries gives you, even today, some kind of special perspective on American life?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, special, not necessarily better. Different, yes, it does, because I am not an American, but I am a person. I like to describe myself as a Nigerian who likes America. And I think not being an American, I don't think I will ever be an American. And so what it means then is that I'm looking at it always from the outside. And even for me as a Nigerian, spending my half of my time in the US means that I'm also looking at Nigeria from the outside. So there's a sense in which it's not that I don't belong in either place, it's that I think I like to think that I'm able to see both places with a kind of clarity that distance gives you.
And would you be able to compare US and the UK? I mean, in terms of the problems that you just outlined, is there any difference?
I don't really. I sometimes feel like I really can't talk about the UK well because I don't know it in that kind of lived way. You know, London is one of my favorite cities in the world, but I don't really get all the nuances of the British. But obviously, I have my Nigeria having been colonized by the British, I have my very strong opinions about certain things. And also feel a connection. You know, this is the thing about coming from a place that was formerly colonized by another place. You do feel a connection to your colonizer. And so maybe it's why I love London. Maybe it's why, English literature speaks to me. But in terms of making comparisons about kind of day-to-day social realities, I don't know that I can. I think, it's common for people to say the problem in the UK is class, not race, but I don't think that's true at all, because you talk to black British people and you realize that race is a big problem. But I don't feel that I know it in a very textured way.
I should think London is slightly different than the rest of the country, isn't it?
This is true, yes, but even London, yeah. But even London has its many problems when it comes to race.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to literature and to your writing, to more technical stuff. since you live in the two countries, do you see yourself as a part of the American literature or Nigerian literature or simple literature in English or global literature?
Literature written in English. Yeah. I think, and I say that with a kind of, I think I'm being quite intentional about saying literature in English because it's not a denial of my being Nigerian and obviously knowing that my work is part of Nigerian literature. But it's because those labels often for me can be problematic. Often for me they're not so much about literature as they are about politics. They're not literary labels, especially if you're a person who comes from a part of the world that is not considered powerful. So in some ways it's almost like being in, kind of like a glorified ghetto, where, African literature is a thing that you read when you want to feel that you're a good person who cares about the poor people of the world, right? But literature from Western Europe and America is what you read when you just want to read literature. And so because of that, I've often felt a kind of reluctance about labels. I remember actually a friend of mine in Sweden saying that he would often give people books as presents, but when he wanted to show that he was a good person, he gave them books set in Africa. And I was so troubled by this, and then when the people would get the books, they too would feel very noble and good because look, we're reading about those poor starving people. And even if the book was not about poor starving people, the fact that it's an African book meant somehow that they were touching their innate goodness. So really, I consider my work part of the canon of literature written in English.
Some of your Czech colleagues, writers, friends of mine, would tell you that still you have a huge advantage since you are, even if coming from not the most powerful country in the world, not in the US, but still you have the privilege of writing in English, which is actually, English has a huge impact, and you have the audience, the global audience, actually. And you spoke about underrepresentation of some literatures. What did you see as a problem?
No, you're right, absolutely. I actually was thinking at the airport today in Prague how incredible it is and how, in a way, sort of the accidental privilege that I have as a native English speaker. And it's an accidental privilege because I happen to have been born in a country that was colonized by the British. Because had my family shifted a bit geographically and sort of fallen into the Republic of Benin, I would be a French speaker because Benin was colonized by the French. But this accidental privilege is one that I find just really remarkable now thinking about it. I'm walking through the airport in Prague, and all of the signs are written in Czech and in English. And there is a kind of, what worries me is that, obviously I'm happy to have this privilege, right? But at the same time, I think about it a lot because, it can give rise to a certain kind of arrogance and a certain kind of closedness where where was I? I think in Iceland, and I'm giving a menu at a restaurant, and I then say, oh, it's not in English. And I remember thinking later, but this is very stupid. You're in Iceland. Why the F should it be in English? But it's that kind of, because English is the global language today in a way that I think 150 years ago it would have been French. And so I think it can create a kind of, if one isn't careful, for the native English speaker, a lack of curiosity, a closedness, and arrogance. Because, unlike the menu in Iceland is not in English, and that was a problem for me because... But yes, I do recognize that writing in English brings about a privilege. And you know what? I do have to say that for me, an Anglophone African, and for other Anglophone Africans, maybe it's the one privilege that we get.